In the year 1738, under the suffocating heat of Puebla de Los Angeles in New Spain, when the air smelled of burnt lime and flies buzzed over the putrid puddles in the street, a mulatto slave named Bernarda held the master's legitimate son in her arms, while a secret grew in her womb that would forever shatter the blood purity that the Solorzano family had protected for 5 generations. The child she was expecting was also the master's, conceived 3 months before the legitimate wife's son. And Bernarda knew it because she had counted every moon, every nausea, every kick in her womb that began long before the movements of the baby she now rocked in her arms, stained with milk, sweat, and the invisible traces of a sin that not even confession could wash away. Bernarda had arrived at the Solorzano mansion at the age of 14, bought in the Veracruz market by Don Jerónimo de Solorzano y Mendoza, a 43-year-old man whose hands always smelled of Cuban tobacco and whose voice sounded like torn velvet when he gave orders. His wife, Doña Catalina de Iturbe y Villarreal, was a small woman with a sharp face who had failed to give him offspring in 12 years of barren marriage, of endless novenas, of pilgrimages to sanctuaries, where she left silver offerings that gleamed under candles like frozen tears. The house always smelled of incense imported from Manila and Spanish guilt, of whispered prayers in dark corridors, and the silent desperation of a woman who felt incomplete in the eyes of God, of her husband, of her deceased mother-in-law, whose portrait in the hall seemed to judge her from the cracked oil painting. Bernarda cleaned the Talavera Poblana floors with their blue and yellow designs. She washed clothes in the backyard, where the well water was icy even in summer. She ironed the linen tablecloths that were only used when the bishop came for dinner. And at night, when the house slept under the weight of its own lies, and the silence became so thick it could be cut with a knife, Don Jerónimo summoned her to his study with a nod that allowed no refusal, that needed no words, that was as ancient as slavery itself. The first time, Bernarda had just turned 15, and the master told her in a calm, almost paternal voice that it was her duty to serve in everything she was asked, that God and the laws of the crown commanded it, and that a slave had no will of her own, but only the will of her master. She did not cry that first time because she had learned in Veracruz that crying only made it hurt more, that resistance was punished with the whip, that the best way to survive was to turn to stone inside while the body did what it was ordered. The last time had been 11 months prior, on a hot May night when Doña Catalina was on a spiritual retreat at the Santa Rosa convent, praying to the Virgin for a miracle that was already gestating in the wrong womb, in the body of a slave who prayed to gods the church called demons. 3 weeks after that night, Doña Catalina returned from the convent radiant as an apparition, with rosy cheeks for the first time in years and eyes sparkling with renewed faith, announcing amidst tears that ran down her face like liquid blessings that God had finally heard her prayers. She was pregnant. Don Jerónimo ordered Thanksgiving masses in all the churches of Puebla. He had the family chapel, which had been neglected for years, repaired. He doubled alms to the poor who lined up every Sunday at the gate and bought a new ivory image of the Virgin of Guadalupe, which cost more than Bernarda would be worth in her entire life. No one noticed that the mulatto slave began to vomit in the mornings behind the chicken coop, nor that her hips widened under her coarse cotton dress, nor that her eyes held that absent gaze of someone carrying a burden they cannot share. The cook, a Zapotec indigenous woman named Jacinta, who had been in the house for 30 years and had seen 2 generations of Solorzanos born and die, was the first to realize it one June dawn when the sky was just beginning to tint pale pink and the roosters were starting their racket. As Bernarda struggled with nausea by the backyard well, one hand on her stomach and the other gripping the cold stone wellhead, Jacinta approached her silently, barefoot, and said in a voice so low it was barely a whisper, "That child you carry is older than the mistress's, much older." It was not a question, it was a pronouncement. Bernarda shook her head desperately, feeling panic constrict her throat, but Jacinta gripped her wrist with an iron strength, with those gnarled fingers that had kneaded thousands of tortillas. "I have seen 4 generations born in this house. I know how to count moons better than the priest counts sins and better than the master counts coins. If that child is born first, even by a day, even by an hour, the bloodline is broken. Do you understand what that means?" Bernarda felt the world tilt beneath her feet, the walls of the house closing in on her like the jaws of a trap. "What do I do?" she whispered with a broken voice. Jacinta abruptly released her and walked away without answering, dragging her bare feet across the patio flagstones. But that same afternoon, she prepared her a bitter tea of rue and cinnamon, mixed with something else she never named, a dark liquid that smelled of wet earth and desperation. Bernarda drank it, crying silently, feeling the liquid burn her throat like liquid fire, praying it would work, yet at the same time praying it wouldn't. But it was no use. The child in her womb clung to life with a supernatural stubbornness that she would later recognize as the only trait he had inherited from her and not from the master, as if that unborn son knew his existence was a rebellion, an involuntary yet powerful act of resistance. Months passed like a Holy Week procession, slow, painful, laden with a solemnity that crushed the air and made breathing difficult. Doña Catalina flourished in her pregnancy like a Castilian rose, surrounded by doctors who came from Mexico City, by Spanish midwives who charged fortunes, by nuns who came to pray for her every afternoon, carrying saints' relics wrapped in red velvet. The house filled with preparations. Seamstresses embroidered christening gowns with gold thread. Carpenters built a mahogany crib carved with cherubim. The priest came every week to bless the room where the heir would be born. Bernarda hid beneath increasingly voluminous shawls. She worked in the darkest areas of the house where the light would not reveal her condition. And at night she slept in the servants' quarters with her hands on her growing belly, feeling the kicks of a child who should not exist, who was a living blasphemy against the order of things. Don Jeronimo avoided her with an almost religious determination, as if not looking at her could erase what he had done, as if ignoring her existence could make the evidence of his sin disappear. One August afternoon, as Bernarda climbed the stairs with difficulty, carrying a basin of hot water that Doña Catalina had requested to wash her swollen feet, she crossed paths with him in the narrow second-floor hallway. Their eyes met for a second that seemed to last an eternity, and in that gaze Bernarda understood everything. He knew, he had known from the beginning, he had counted the months just like her, and prayed every night at his walnut prayer kneeler for the problem to resolve itself, for her to lose the child or die in childbirth, as so many enslaved women did, for God to cleanse his sin without demanding public confession or social penance. The 8th month arrived with torrential rains that flooded the streets of Puebla and turned the city into a putrid quagmire where dead dogs and uncollected trash floated. Doña Catalina fainted during Sunday Mass, falling like a sack of corn onto the cathedral tiles, while the choir sang a psalm and the ladies cried out for smelling salts and holy water. Dr. Villagran, an old man with a white beard who smelled of brandy, declared that labor might begin prematurely and that the lady should observe absolute bed rest. That same night, as if Bernarda's body responded to an invisible call, she felt the first contractions. She bit her lips until they bled, clung to the wooden cot that creaked under her weight, and prayed not to the god of the white people who permitted slavery, but to Yamaya, the goddess of the sea, whom her mother had taught her to invoke in secret before dying on the ship that brought them from Africa, before being thrown into the ocean as unnecessary ballast. Jacinta appeared at the door of the servants' quarters like a materialized shadow, with a candle trembling in her wrinkled hand and an expression of ancient resignation etched into the deep lines of her face. "Don't scream," she said with a voice like stone. "If you scream, they will come. If they come, they will kill you and the child, or worse, they will separate you from him forever. Bite this." She gave her a piece of leather that tasted of salt and old blood. Bernarda nodded and clenched her teeth on the leather, while her body split in two, while the pain pierced her like a red-hot knife. Outside, the cathedral bells marked the hours of an endless night. The child was born when the bells chimed matins, in that dark hour just before dawn, when demons roam, according to the old women's belief. He was small, wrinkled like a premature old man, the color of light mud after rain, with black, straight hair matted to his skull and eyes closed like clenched fists. Jacinta cleaned him with cold well water, cut the cord with a knife she heated in the candle, and wrapped him in an old rag that had once been part of a sheet from the main house. "It's a boy," she said. "Boy." And in her voice there was something akin to sorrow, to compassion, because a male child meant an heir, meant a bloodline, meant a much bigger problem than if it had been a girl. Bernarda took him in her trembling arms and felt a love so fierce it frightened her. A love that was also hatred and fear and rage, because this child was hers and the master's. He was both slave and heir, He was everything and nothing. He was a living paradox that should not exist in a world ordered by castes and certificates of blood purity. "What am I going to do?" she asked again, her voice broken by uncontrollable sobs, rocking back and forth with the baby against her chest. Jacinta did not answer. She just stood there looking at the child with those dark eyes that had seen too much. But 3 days later, when Doña Catalina gave birth to a healthy, robust boy who cried so loudly he was heard throughout the house, a child the master named Jerónimo after himself and his father and grandfather before him, Jacinta went to the servants' quarters, where Bernarda was silently breastfeeding her son, and said in a voice that sounded ancient as time, "Your son was born first, 3 days first, according to the law of God and men, according to Roman law that governs all inheritances. The firstborn carries the father's pure blood. The firstborn is the legitimate heir, regardless of who the mother is. But no one must ever know. If anyone finds out, if the truth comes to light, they will not only kill you, they will kill the child. Because a mulatto son born before the legitimate heir is not just a scandal, it is a threat against the very order of the world." Bernarda secretly breastfed her son during the dark nights, hiding in the damp, sour-smelling servants' quarters, whispering songs her mother had sung to her in a language she was forgetting. And during the day, she breastfed Doña Catalina's son because the lady did not have enough milk, and the doctor had ordered them to find a wet nurse. And who better than Bernarda, who had just given birth and had full breasts? Thus, Bernarda became the wet nurse for the legitimate heir, feeding him with the same substance she fed her own son, invisibly, irreversibly mixing their bloodlines, while her own son grew in the shadows of the servants' quarters, quiet and observant, as if instinctively knowing that silence was survival, with the master's clear eyes that shone in the darkness and her strong hands that, even after only a few months, gripped with supernatural strength. She named him Miguel after the archangel who expels demons from paradise, hoping that name would protect him from what he was, from what he represented, from the truth that could destroy them all. For 2 years, the children grew up together without knowing each other, separated by walls but united by blood and milk. Little Geronimo in the mahogany crib, carved by artisans from Oaxaca, dressed in lace imported from Brussels, blessed by bishops who came from Tlaxcala. Miguel in a wooden crate that had once held oranges, dressed in fabric scraps that Jacinta secretly sewed, invisible to everyone except the 2 women, who sometimes brought him tortillas with mashed beans and stroked his hair with a tenderness she reserved only for the condemned, for those born in the wrong place in the world. But children grow, and secrets grow with them. They become heavier, more dangerous. When Miguel was 3 years old and already walking with firm steps, he escaped from the servants' quarters one afternoon while Bernarda was washing clothes in the patio and appeared like an apparition in the main garden, where little Geronimo was playing with a wooden hobby horse under the watchful eye of his mother and a Spanish governess. Doña Catalina was petrified upon seeing the light-eyed mulatto child, who looked at her son with innocent curiosity, his head tilted in exactly the same way Geronimo tilted his head when something caught his attention. "Whose child is this?" she asked with a trembling voice, bringing a hand to her chest. Bernarda rushed out of the kitchen, her hands still wet, grabbed Miguel with more force than necessary, and carried him away while mumbling apologies, but the damage was done. Doña Catalina had seen and had understood something she did not want to understand. That night, Don Jerónimo summoned Bernarda to his study. It was the first time they had been alone since Miguel's birth, since that night more than 3 years ago. The study smelled of tobacco and Spanish brandy. The master sat behind his walnut desk, his face gray as cigarette ash, his eyes sunken in dark sockets. "Is he mine?" he asked without looking at her, looking instead at his hands clasped on the desk. Bernarda thought of lying. She had lied so many times. She had built her survival on lies, but she was tired, so tired of lies. "Yes, master," she said in a barely audible voice. Don Jerónimo closed his eyes as if praying, as if asking for strength. When exactly was he born? 3 days before little Geronimo, master, on Thursday morning. The silence that followed was so heavy that Bernarda felt she would suffocate, that the air in her lungs had turned solid. The wall clock ticked the seconds with a sound like hammer blows. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, the master spoke in a voice that barely trembled. "No one can know. No one in this city, no one in this house beyond those who already know. If anyone else finds out, if this becomes public, I will sell you to the Veracruz plantations, where they cut sugarcane from dawn until they die, and you will never see that child again. Do you understand?" Bernarda nodded, feeling hot tears roll down her cheeks. But I need you to do something else for me, Don Geronimo continued, and now there was a hint of desperation in his voice. I need to be sure that my son, my legitimate son, is the undisputed heir of this lineage. I need to protect this family's honor. He took a document from his desk, thick paper with the official seal of the municipal council. It was a death certificate. Bernarda did not understand what he meant until the master explained in a monotone voice. Are you going to state here that your son died at birth? That he was stillborn or died within a few hours? And you will swear before God and the law that you will never tell the truth. Bernarda looked at the document, the letters dancing before her eyes blurred by tears. To sign meant to kill Miguel on paper, to turn him into a legal ghost, into someone who officially had never breathed. But not to sign meant losing him forever to the plantations where enslaved children died before turning 10, where heat, disease, and labor killed faster than any whip. She took the quill with a hand that trembled so much she could barely write. She dipped the tip in the inkwell and signed. A shaky X, because she had never been taught to write her name. The master blew on the ink to dry it, put the document in an iron chest, and locked it with a key that hung on a chain around his neck. Now go, he said without looking at her, and keep that child out of my sight, away from this house whenever possible. Let him learn a trade. Let him leave when he is old enough, but let him never know the truth. Years passed as they do in the lives of enslaved people, slow and fast at the same time, laden with endless work and stolen moments of tenderness. Miguel grew up on the periphery of the main house, helping in the kitchen when he was small, carrying firewood when he was older, invisible yet present, like all the master's secret children, like a ghost only some could see. Bernarda watched him from afar during the day, unable to hug him in public, unable to tell him she loved him more than her own life, because love was a dangerous luxury that enslaved people could not afford where others could see. Little Geronimo grew up spoiled and protected as the heir to the Solorzano fortune, learning Latin and rhetoric with a Spanish tutor who charged a fortune, riding the Arabian horse his father gave him at age 8, wearing clothes that cost more than everything Bernarda would earn in her life if she had been free. Sometimes the two boys crossed paths in the backyard, in the stables, in the kitchen where both would go to steal freshly baked bread, and they looked at each other with the instinctive curiosity of those who share something invisible and unspeakable. No one else noticed that they had exactly the same way of tilting their heads when thinking deeply, the same frown when concentrating, the same way of touching their chin with their thumb when doubting. When Miguel turned 7, the year children from decent families made their first communion, Doña Catalina announced amidst tears of happiness that she was pregnant again. But this time the pregnancy was complicated from the start. The lady spent her days in bed, pale as a shroud, vomiting not only food, but dark blood that stained the linen sheets. Doctors came and went, scratching their heads, not understanding what was wrong with her. They brought a famous healer from Cholula, who diagnosed the evil eye, and sprinkled holy water mixed with herbs throughout the house. The priest personally came to exorcise the room, waving an aspergillum and murmuring Latin prayers that sounded like curses. But Doña Catalina continued to worsen, wasting away like a candle, her eyes growing larger and larger in an increasingly shrinking face. One October night, as Bernarda brought her a chicken broth that the lady would probably vomit, she heard her murmur in her feverish delirium, "It's God's punishment. Punishment for closing my eyes, for pretending not to see." She didn't finish the sentence, but her feverish eyes fixed on Bernarda with terrible clarity, a sudden lucidity that cut through the fever. At that precise moment, Bernarda knew with absolute certainty that Doña Catalina knew. Perhaps she had always known. Perhaps wives always know, always intuit, always count the months in their husband's absences and the glances he avoids. Doña Catalina lost the baby in the 5th month, a fetus that was born blue and silent amidst a pool of blood that soaked the mattress. For entire weeks, the house filled with weeping funeral masses, endless rosaries that the ladies of the city prayed in the main parlor. Don Geronimo, aged 10 years and a month, his hair turned completely white. He began to walk hunched over as if carrying the weight of the world, and Bernarda felt a guilt she could not name or confess, because a dark and terrible part of her soul, a part that deeply shamed her, secretly rejoiced that there was no other legitimate heir, that Miguel remained the true, albeit secret, firstborn, the first in the bloodline, though the last in all else. Years followed their inexorable course. Geronimo turned 15, and his father began methodically preparing him to inherit the family estate. Haciendas that produced corn and beans, silver mines in the Taxco Mountains, import businesses that brought silks from China and wines from Spain. Miguel turned 15, and his mother found him a place as a blacksmith's apprentice with a mestizo named Toribio, who had a workshop near the market outside the house because Don Geronimo could no longer bear to see him. Because every time he saw the boy, it was like looking into a distorted mirror that reflected his own sin. The two boys no longer crossed paths in the house, but Puebla was a small city, enclosed by mountains, where everyone knew each other and secrets circulated like water through irrigation ditches. Sometimes they met in the Plaza Mayor, in the Parian Market, where everything imaginable was sold, at the cathedral door on Sundays, when the whole city went to Mass. And always, there was a silent recognition between them, that strange feeling of looking into a broken mirror that reflected both the same and the opposite. The definitive breaking point came in the year 1753, 15 years after the boy's birth, when a new chief magistrate arrived in Puebla directly sent from Mexico City, with specific orders from the royal court to investigate accumulated complaints of corruption, illegal slave trade, and falsification of blood purity documents. Don Felipe de Cardenas was a meticulous man around 50 years old, incorruptible to the point of fanaticism, obsessed with order, and with an almost mystical idea of justice. He was one of those dangerous officials who genuinely believe in laws and want to apply them regardless of whom they harm. He began to review all official city records with the patience of a goldsmith: births, deaths, baptisms, marriages, commercial transactions, blood purity certificates, slave registers. One suffocating August afternoon, he summoned Don Geronimo to his office in the municipal palace. Bernarda was at the market buying chilies when she saw the master return home in mid-afternoon, something completely unusual. His face was the color of ash. He walked as if his legs were heavy. That night, she heard furious voices coming from the study despite the closed doors. Doña Catalina wept with sobs that shook her entire fragile body. Don Geronimo shouted incomprehensible things. The next day, Jacinta told Bernarda with a voice like stone, "The chief magistrate found something in the papers. I don't know exactly what, but he found a discrepancy, a date that doesn't add up, and now he's asking questions." For 3 terrible weeks, the tension in the Solorzano house was unbearable. Don Geronimo stopped eating, stopped sleeping. He spent nights in his study, drinking brandy and staring intently at the iron chest where he kept the document Bernarda had signed 15 years earlier. Doña Catalina locked herself in her room with her rosaries and saint cards, praying incessantly, as if prayers could change the past. And then, one September morning, when the sky was gray and threatened rain, 3 constables arrived at the house looking for Bernarda. They took her to the municipal palace, to a cold room with stone walls and a small window through which insufficient light entered. The chief magistrate, Don Felipe de Cardenas, awaited her, seated behind a dark wooden desk covered with papers, files, yellowish documents. "Bernarda, registered slave of Don Geronimo de Solorzano y Mendoza," he said in a formal voice that resonated in the stone walls. "I have here a document signed by you, or rather marked with your symbol exactly 15 years ago, certifying that your male child died at birth. But I also have testimonies gathered from at least 6 different neighbors, including a market vendor and a water carrier, who swear under oath to have seen for years a mulatto boy of approximately the correct age living in the Solorzano house, a child who, according to several corroborating testimonies, remarkably resembled the master. Can you explain this discrepancy?" Bernarda felt the world stop, that time itself ceased to flow. Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure the chief magistrate could hear it. "Where is that child now?" Don Felipe asked, leaning forward with hawk-like eyes that missed no detail. Bernarda opened her mouth, but no sound came out. The chief magistrate waited. She finally managed to whisper, "I don't know what child your honor is referring to." The chief magistrate slammed his open palm on the table, a dry sound that made Bernarda jump. "Don't lie to me. I perfectly understand your fear. I understand you are protecting the master, perhaps protecting yourself, but I need the truth. Because if that child exists, and is indeed Don Geronimo de Solorzano's son, and if he was born before the recognized legitimate heir, then there is an extremely serious legal problem." The family's blood purity certificates, the inheritances, future marriages, everything is at stake. The law is very clear regarding firstborns, regardless of the legitimacy of birth. Bernarda stared at the chief magistrate for a long moment, seeing in his eyes the determination of a man who truly believed in justice, who sought neither money nor favors but simply the truth. And she understood she was at the most important crossroads of her life. She could continue lying, protect the master who had violated her, keep the secret she had carried like a stone in her chest for 15 interminable years. Or she could tell the truth and destroy the Solorzano family, but also potentially destroy her son, because Miguel would be trapped in a scandal that would mark him forever, that would make him the center of a conflict he had not asked for. "My son died at birth," she finally said, forcing the words out of her constricted throat. "As the paper I signed states." The chief magistrate studied her in silence for what seemed an eternity. "Are you completely sure?" he asked. "Because if you are lying under formal oath before a representative of the crown, the consequences will be extremely severe. You could be sold, you could be sent to the mines, you could lose all contact with anyone you know." "I am sure, Your Honor," Bernarda said, and this time her voice did not tremble because she had made a decision. The chief magistrate nodded slowly, disappointed but not surprised. "You may go, but this investigation is not over." Bernarda left the municipal palace with trembling legs, feeling she might collapse at any moment onto the street's cobblestones, but she did not immediately return to the Solorzano house. Instead, she walked like a somnambulist through the streets of Puebla until she reached the blacksmith's workshop where Miguel worked. She found him hammering a horseshoe on the anvil, his bare torso glistening with sweat under the afternoon sun, muscles tensing beneath skin the color of light mud, so much like his father that it hurt to look at him. When Miguel saw her standing at the workshop door, he dropped the hammer with a clang and approached, wiping his hands on a dirty rag. "Mother," he said, and it was probably the first time he had used that word aloud in a public space where someone might hear. Bernarda hugged him and wept against his chest, which smelled of hot iron and honest sweat. She wept for all the years of silence, all the years of lies. "I need to tell you something," she whispered against his chest. "Something I should have told you a long time ago. Something that will change everything you know about who you are." They sat in the workshop's backyard among rusted metal scraps and abandoned tools. And Bernarda told him everything. She told him about Don Jeronimo, about the nights in the study she could not refuse, about the simultaneous pregnancy with Doña Catalina, about the birth dates, about the document she had signed, legally killing him. She told him about the chief magistrate's visit, about the investigation, about the dangerous questions. Miguel listened in absolute silence, his face growing harder and harder, his fists clenching until his knuckles turned white. When Bernarda finished speaking, exhausted and empty, Miguel asked in a voice that sounded strange, "Why are you telling me this now? Why after 15 years of silence?" "Because I can no longer bear this secret alone," Bernarda said. "It is killing me inside. It is turning me to stone. And because you are my son, and you deserve to know the truth about who you are. Even if that truth cannot change anything in the real world. Even if that truth only brings more pain." Miguel remained silent for a long time, looking at the sky that was tinged orange with the sunset. Finally, he said with a voice full of cold rage, "I am the eldest son. I am the true firstborn. According to all the laws I have heard mentioned, I should be that man's heir." "But you are not legitimate," Bernarda said with infinite sadness. "And you are mulatto, the son of an enslaved woman, and even if you were free, the color of your skin marks you. There is no law in this new Spain that can give you what is rightfully yours by birth date and by blood." Miguel clenched his fists until they trembled. "Then blood is worth nothing," he said bitterly. "At least not the blood of people like us." That night, Miguel did not sleep in the workshop as he usually did. He walked through the streets of Puebla under the stars, thinking, deciding, and the next day, when the sun was just beginning to appear over the volcanoes, he did something that would irrevocably change everything. He went directly to the municipal palace and firmly asked to speak with the chief magistrate. Don Felipe de Cardenas, who was reviewing papers in his office, received him with curiosity. Miguel stood before his desk and said without preamble, I am Bernarda's son, the son who supposedly died at birth, according to that document you have. And I am also the son of Don Jerónimo de Solorzano y Mendoza. I was born on the morning of Thursday, August 12, 1738. My father's legitimate son was born on Sunday, August 15th of the same year. I am the true firstborn. The chief magistrate remained completely still, only his eyes moving over Miguel's face, studying him. Do you have proof of what you say? My mother can now testify under true oath. The cook Jacinta can also confirm it. She assisted my mother during childbirth. And if you want more proof, Your Honor, look closely at me. Look at me and tell me if you do not see Don Jerónimo in my eyes, in my nose, in the shape of my hands. The chief magistrate studied Miguel for a long moment. Do you know what you are unleashing, young man? Do you understand that this will not give you the inheritance you believe you deserve, but it will destroy lives, possibly including your own? Yes, Miguel said with an unwavering voice. I know perfectly well, but I have lived 15 years as a ghost, as someone who legally does not exist, and I can no longer continue like this. Let the truth destroy what it must destroy, but let it exist. The news spread through Puebla like fire in a dry wheat field during the dry season. In less than 3 days, the entire city was talking about the monstrous scandal of the Solorzanos. The chief magistrate, Don Felipe de Cardenas, immediately opened a formal investigation, summoning testimonies and reviewing records. He called Bernarda to testify again, this time under explicit threat of imprisonment if she lied, and Bernarda, her voice breaking but firm, confirmed everything. He called Jacinta, who, with her tired old woman's voice, confirmed the precise dates of both births. He called the Spanish midwife who had assisted Doña Catalina, Doña Mercedes Villegas, who reviewed her meticulous records and admitted that the child had indeed been born several days after the date they originally expected based on the lady's last period. Don Jerónimo was formally summoned to the municipal palace for 6 interminable hours in a room filled with scribes who wrote down every word and respectable city witnesses. The chief magistrate interrogated him methodically. At first, Don Jerónimo denied everything with offended indignation, shouting about his family's honor, threatening to write to the viceroy. But the chief magistrate was relentless, presenting testimony after testimony, date after date, contradiction after contradiction in the official records. Finally, at dusk, when the candles had been lit and shadows lengthened on the stone walls, Don Jerónimo collapsed like a building whose columns give way. Yes, he said with a broken voice, his head in his hands. The mulatto is mine. He is my son. He was born before Jerónimo, 3 days before, but he is not legitimate. He has no rights. He cannot inherit absolutely anything. The chief magistrate carefully took notes with his quill pen. That, Don Jerónimo, the royal court in Mexico City will decide, not you. But there is something else I need you to understand with absolute clarity. You falsified official documents of the crown. You forced an enslaved woman to sign a false death certificate. That is a serious crime against the law. The complete case was sent to the Royal Court of Mexico City with all testimonies, documents, and evidence. The most expensive lawyers Don Jerónimo could hire passionately argued that Miguel, being the son of an enslaved woman according to the laws of the time, was automatically a slave himself, regardless of who his father was or when he was born. That legitimate children always had absolute precedence over illegitimate children in matters of inheritance. That blood purity, the very foundation of New Spain's social order, could not be contaminated with enslaved blood. That accepting Miguel's petition would open the door to total chaos where any illegitimate child could claim inheritances. The royal prosecutor, for his part, argued with equal passion that the law was extraordinarily clear regarding firstborns, who had special rights recognized since Roman law, that falsifying official documents to hide the truth was a crime deserving severe punishment, that even if Miguel could not inherit due to his status as an illegitimate child, the Solorzano family had committed documented fraud and had to face consequences. The 3 judges of the royal court deliberated for 3 full months, reviewing legal precedents that stretched back centuries. Meanwhile, all of Puebla was divided as never before. Distinguished Spanish families fiercely defended the Solorzanos, saying in their social gatherings and in church courtyards that it was absolutely unthinkable, an abomination against nature, that a mulatto could even dream of inheriting the estate of a Spanish family with a proven lineage. But others, especially among the mestizos, The indigenous people, the few free black people, and the mulattoes of the city saw in Miguel a powerful symbol of something much greater than his individual case. Living proof that Spanish blood was not as pure as its owners presumed, that the secret children of the masters carried exactly the same blood as the legitimate heirs raised in mahogany cribs, that the entire caste system was built upon systematic lies and normalized violations. The final sentence arrived in December 1753, just before Christmas. The judges unanimously ruled that Miguel, being the son of an enslaved mother, lacked any right of inheritance, regardless of birth order or proven paternity. That was expected. But they also ruled, and this was more surprising, that Don Jerónimo de Solórzano had committed serious falsification of official documents and had to pay an extremely significant fine of 2,000 gold pesos, a fortune. Furthermore, and this was truly shocking for all of Puebla society, they explicitly ordered that Miguel be immediately and unconditionally manumitted, freed forever from any bonds of slavery as partial, though insufficient, compensation for the documented moral damage, and they ordered Don Jerónimo to pay Miguel a sum of 500 pesos as reparation for judicially recognized paternity. It was not justice, not truly, not the justice that laws proclaim to guarantee. Miguel did not obtain the inheritance that was chronologically his. He did not obtain the illustrious surname. He did not obtain the social recognition or position that his paternal blood should have given him. But he obtained something. He obtained legal freedom, documented, irrevocable, and he obtained something perhaps more valuable. The truth recorded forever in the official archives of the royal court, impossible to erase, permanent as stone. His existence, his birth, his paternity, all were documented in records that scribes copied with black ink on paper that would last for centuries. Miguel de Puebla, son of Bernarda and Don Jerónimo de Solórzano, born on August 12, 1738, 3 days before the legitimate heir. That truth now existed officially, legally, eternally. Don Jerónimo never recovered from the scandal that destroyed his reputation, like fire destroys dry wood. He died 2 years later, in 1755, embittered and isolated in his own home, avoided by families who once sought him for business and advantageous marriages. His name had become synonymous with hypocrisy, falsification, and concealed violation. Doña Catalina, unable to bear the weight of public shame, secluded herself in the Santa Rosa convent as a secular nun, spending her last years praying endless rosaries in a small cell that smelled of wax and old tears. Young Jerónimo, the legitimate heir, inherited an intact estate but a destroyed name. Whenever someone mentioned the Solórzano surname in Puebla, in social gatherings or at the market, they inevitably remembered the mulatto son, the secret firstborn, the scandal that had revealed the lies upon which the entire society was founded. Bernarda lived to be 62 years old, an extraordinary age for a woman who had been enslaved. She worked as a free laundress in Puebla, earning her livelihood with the same hands that had cleaned the Talavera floors of the Solórzano house. She was never rich, never respected in the social circles she once served as an invisible slave. But she lived free the last years of her life, and saw her son also live free, marry, have children, build a life she could never have imagined when she secretly gave birth to him on that dark August morning. Miguel married a mestiza woman named Josefa, daughter of a carpenter and an Otomi indigenous woman. They had 3 children who grew up free, who never knew the taste of the whip or the weight of chains, who learned honest trades as blacksmiths, carpenters, weavers. His surname was not merely a name. When pressed about his origins, Miguel would say with a mix of pride and bitterness, "My mother was named Bernarda de Puebla, and she was the bravest woman I have ever known, because she dared to speak the truth when all of society demanded her silence." Jacinta died shortly after the trial, in the spring of 1754, in her 80s. On her deathbed, as candles burned and the priest murmured the last rites, she called Bernarda to her side and said in a voice that was barely a whisper, "You did well to speak in the end. That secret was devouring you from within like a cancer. Sometimes you have to poison a lineage to cleanse the blood. Sometimes the only way to heal is to let the wound open completely." These were strange, almost prophetic words, but Bernarda understood them perfectly, because that was exactly what she had done. She had poisoned the Solórzano lineage, not with physical toxins or witchcraft spells, but with something much more powerful and permanent, with the truth. She had contaminated their blood purity, not because her son was mulatto, but because she had forced society to publicly acknowledge what everyone knew but no one spoke aloud. That Spanish blood in the colonies was as mixed as the mud in the streets after torrential rains. That legitimate heirs, raised in mahogany cribs, had secret siblings working in kitchens and stables and workshops. That the entire caste system was an elaborate theater where everyone pretended not to see what was obvious. That blood purity certificates were false documents protecting convenient lies. Over the years, Bernarda's story became something larger than herself, a legend told in markets and public fountains where women washed clothes. Some, especially among Spanish families, said she had been a witch who had bewitched the master with African potions. Others, crueler and eager to protect the comfort of the powerful, insisted she must have been a calculating temptress, a schemer who had deliberately ruined an honorable household to avenge her enslaved status. But the truth preserved in surviving colonial legal records, fragile, dust-muted, yet still readable, is simpler and far more devastating. Bernarda was 14 when she was sold in Veracruz as property. She was taken into a household where her owner abused her in ways the law rarely named plainly, but the body always remembers. In time, she became pregnant, by the same man who fathered a child with his legitimate wife within the same season, and from that moment, she carried an impossible secret inside an impossible world. For 15 long years, she lived under the weight of that knowledge while raising her son in the margins, where people like them were expected to exist quietly, without questions, without claims, without names that could survive on paper. Then, when an unusually principled magistrate created a narrow opening, one of those rare moments when the machinery of power briefly admitted testimony from the powerless, Bernarda spoke, not because she believed it would make her rich, not because she believed it would elevate her station. She spoke knowing the truth could cost her what little safety she had, knowing it could shatter reputations, marriages, fortunes, and the carefully staged innocence of a family that depended on everyone else's silence. And even if her words did not deliver complete justice, if they secured only a precarious measure of freedom for her son in a world that would never fully accept him as equal, she still did the unthinkable. She broke the sacred silence that kept New Spain's social order standing. An enslaved woman's voice, carried into a royal court built to hear only men of rank, became part of the record. That was her true poison, more enduring than any healer's remedy, more lethal than any whispered superstition. Not the child conceived without consent, but the sentence finally spoken after 15 years of enforced quiet. Truth in a society engineered to function on coordinated denial. Testimony in a legal system that depended on the invisibility of enslaved people, a voice that refused to remain a rumor. Because once truth entered the Solorzano lineage as official ink, it could not be scrubbed away. It stained their claims of purity, not as gossip, not as insinuation, but as documented contradiction. It marked them in the colonial imagination as a household that had manufactured appearances, concealed inconvenient facts, and bent royal paperwork to preserve a fiction of blood that had never been as clean as their certificate pretended. Bernarda died on a bright September afternoon in 1760 in a humble adobe house that was hers, bought with what she earned as a free laundress, surrounded by 3 grandchildren. Her last words, as her daughter-in-law Josefa later recalled through tears, were for Miguel, who held her weathered hand. "Never be ashamed of who you are, my son. The blood in your veins is the same blood that runs in any Solorzano who boasts of nobility. The only difference is that you know where you come from. You know the whole truth of your origin. And that truth, however painful, however unrewarded, is worth more than any inheritance of land or silver." They buried her in the San Francisco cemetery in a modest grave, without carved stone, because freed people seldom received the kind of monuments that promised permanence. But her name endured another way. In the stories women in Puebla repeated while washing clothes at the fountains, in the lowered voices that spread when a household discovered a hidden child, in the city's memory of a scandal that refused to die. Because Bernarda de Puebla did not poison her master's lineage with any potion or imported magic. She poisoned it with something stronger and harder to neutralize, the truth spoken aloud before witnesses, made durable by clerks and seals, repeated through depositions, copied and recopied, and carried forward as a quiet indictment. That truth flowed through colonial history like a slow, irreversible toxin, a reminder that Blood purity certificates were legal theater, that many of the most celebrated lineages were built atop unspoken coercion, that the caste system depended on forgetting what it continually produced, that distinguished households often hid their own contradictions in kitchens, back rooms, and ledgers, asking everyone to see and not see at the same time. From the distance of centuries, her act reads as a profound form of resistance, not the romantic violence of legend, not the desperate flight that so often ended in capture, but the simplest, most dangerous refusal, telling the complete truth when asked directly, forcing it onto paper, making it permanent. Bernarda did poison a proud lineage, of that there is no doubt, but in doing so, she also revealed the deeper poison already circulating through the entire structure of New Spain, a system meticulously maintained by normalized abuse, erased identities, and the institutional denial of countless children who shared the blood of legitimate heirs, but none of their protections. Her story did not end with her peaceful death that September afternoon. Miguel had children, and those children had their own children. Few, if any, ever carried the Solorzano surname in official documents, but they carried something more valuable, the living memory of Bernarda, the enslaved woman who chose dangerous truth over false safety and who would rather taint a lineage built on lies than continue protecting the lie that had kept her life in chains,